In a prior video, I talked about the if I had to try and make an argument for not having total freedom of speech, what would it look like, right? Because I tend to feel pretty strongly that freedom of speech is a good thing. So I was trying to think about the contrarian side of it and what would that argument look like. And one of the points I made was to say, somebody that doesn't support free speech wants to see certain people, if they have, views that are believed as hateful or just not aligned with what you believe is right, you want them shut down. What's the motivation behind that? What's the rational thought, assuming there is some, which I believe that there is. And one of the hypotheses was you just don't trust the mass population. You don't believe that they are equipped enough to hear a message like that and be able to assess it objectively, decipher if there's any validity to it, and make a good educated decision on it. The fear is that most people can be easily manipulated, influenced, and if that message is spread, there's going to be enough people who hear it and think, oh, wow, that's true. I didn't think of it that way, and then become racist or, bigots or communists or whatever it is, right? So, as I went down that path, you get pretty quickly to this moral dilemma, which is, A, who's to say what speech is racist or communist or bigoted, and that it's dangerous, right? Who's to say what level of speech is that, where it hits that threshold? And then two, who decides that we need to, quote unquote, save people from themselves, and that somebody makes a decision that I don't have enough faith in, society to hear this message, so I'm going to shut it down. Who makes that call, right? Like, is that even the right thing to do to, again, save people from themselves? So you kind of get down that path and you run into a little bit of trouble there. So I've been thinking about that idea, right? And where do you go with that? How does it play out? What are the implications if it's true? And it's a tricky thing because, for years now, I've been, thinking a lot about how we think, how our minds work, the flaws in how our minds work, the biases, the identity issues we have, all the things that lead us to our minds working in a flawed way. And I don't have definitive proof that is in fact true, but speaking for myself, as well as what I observe in others, I believe it to be true. I believe there'd be truth to that for sure. So if you believe that, logically you would say, well, okay, maybe people aren't well suited to understand these things, right? Or to handle these messages. And it's beyond just, I use the example of like a college campus speaker. It's beyond that, right? It's social media. It's cable news and 24-hour news cycles, the Fox Newses, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, where there's, a very, oftentimes very slanted messages, very agenda driven. Their business is ultimately, they're trying to get more viewers, more clicks, they're trying to play to their base. All of those things, you start to call into question and say, are we as humans able to handle that, right? You log onto Facebook and you start scrolling through your feed, and if you're not really active about it, if you're not really on top of it, all of a sudden you're getting all of these things that are hitting you that you may not even realize that are impacting your thoughts and your opinions and your mood and your actions and all that stuff. I likened it in a recent conversation. I was talking with somebody and we talked about it like it's almost like there's a radioactivity there when you think of social media or media, and it's constantly emitting this toxic, slanted, non-objective information that people are consuming, and it's hurting them, right? And it's hurting, everybody to an extent, but it becomes particularly problematic when the people don't, well, let me say it this way. It becomes particularly problematic when the people consuming that radioactive toxicity think they're immune to it, which I think happens in many cases, which really just compounds the issue. So you have people that seemingly are aware that there's problems in the media, social media, it's a bad thing, but for some reason they think they are above it. They've seen it, they're immune to it, therefore it's not a problem. And I can't tell you how many times I see that anecdotally, right? I don't have data on it, but constantly in conversations I have, I'll hear people say from all sides of the spectrum, cable media is bad, social media is bad, but then they're on there and they're active and they're watching it and they're consuming it. And you liken it back to this radioactive example or analogy that they've been given this suit that they think protects them from it, so they go right in head first to it and they say, hey, I'm well equipped to handle this and figure it out and decipher the right messages, but their suit is no good. Right? It doesn't actually protect them at all, and so they're in the most danger, and in some ways the most danger to everybody else. So again, with that concept in mind, you bring it back to this point of, if you don't trust the population to be able to handle the message, is that necessarily wrong? And how do you handle that? Is there a way to account for that and address it? You could think of Nazi Germany as the obvious example, but there's plenty of people being complicit in things and kind of going along with things and being manipulated into things. And it's happened in America, it's happened in other countries, it's happened in all different organizations. And the question is always, how could that happen? Well, it happens because our minds are super flawed, right? As we talk about. And if we are being fed information and we're not actively aware of it, the way it seeps into our mind, the way it primes us to start thinking certain ways, it leads to all sorts of issues. So that's how that stuff happens. So are you right to try and avoid that, to try and actively stop speech that you fear might go that way? And I still think I come back to the point that that's too slippery of a slope. It's too subjective. It's too much of a moral dilemma. Although, on surface it makes sense, unless you could have this kind of benevolent dictator, godlike figure who you knew was genuinely looking out for the right, the good of humanity, and consistently was, that could decide what speech we let go through and what we don't. It's just people making those decisions, and people are flawed. At best, they're flawed. At worst, they're malicious. So I just don't see a scenario where you can have that, where it works. So there has to be a different way, right? I say this somewhat to the people that, on both sides, that are trying to censor speech, that are trying to censor viewpoints, and don't think people should be able to do this or that, or feel this way or feel that way. You have to play it out. You have to play it out, as I talked about before, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th level down, those consequences, and say, where does it go? And I don't think it leads to a good path. So for my mind, and I guess in a lot of ways, that's why I'm making these videos and heading down this journey, is you need to equip people better. You need to train people better. You need to prepare them for this world that we live in, and this radioactive, stuff that's out there, of how to protect themselves from it. You need to equip them with the tools as best you can to do that, and help make them aware of it. And I don't have the answer to it yet, but I started thinking about maybe a parallel that might help me think about it. And one of the things I think about a lot is mixed martial arts, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is something that I'm really into. And it doesn't always matter what the thing is. It's just, if you know it well, it helps you think in abstract terms and come to a conclusion. So for me, that's often, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or mixed martial arts. But point being, one of the things that I feel, and I've been told and people believe, is so beneficial about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is that it's one of the few martial arts that you can train 100%, right? You can actually spar and compete with somebody in practice and go 100%, because the nature of it is it's a grappling, wrestling type martial art, and it's all submission based. So once you lock in a submission of some sort, your partner can just tap, and then you don't have to break his arm or choke him out or, tear his ankle or ligaments or anything like that. You just stop. But everything up until that point of the tap feels real, right? It's a real experience. So it really hones your skills and gets you sharper than other martial arts, say like a karate or other ones where, even boxing or something like that, kickboxing, where you can't really train live. You could spar, but you have headgear on, you're taking it easy, you're not trying to actually hurt the other person, and the nature of the activity is such where if you really want to train it, you really have to throw your punches 100%, and it just doesn't allow you to do that. So, the interesting thing about that is, when the UFC was first created, UFC 1, it was the first time where all those martial arts came together, and you saw how they all played out, and what worked and what didn't, and there was boxers, and there was karate, and there was all different things, and there was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu won. So I think there's something interesting in that, where, when you practice by yourself, if you will, when you don't actually test yourself and you're just consuming something in a very one-dimensional way, it gives you confidence, right? It gives you this feel of like, hey, I'm an expert at this, I'm good at this, I know this, whatever it is, and I'm forced to use it. I will be great at it. And I see a parallel to that in the way people think. I have family members, I have friends, I have plenty of people who, I'll just use this example, you know, they watch a ton of Fox News and their Facebook feed is filled with all sorts of things that are conservative and Republican and Trump driven. And when I talk to them, there's that same level of certainty that the karate practitioner or the boxer had going into the first UFC event of like, hey, I know this so well, I'm so good at this, like I'm gonna destroy whatever comes in front of me. And you could see that same view from a person thinking, whatever argument, whatever viewpoint, whatever insight the other side has, I'm so well prepared to destroy that because I'm so tuned in on this. You know, I've watched Fox News, I've done all this. Again, and speaking to what we said before, isn't aware of how much they're being influenced, how much they're being fed and told what they should believe. They don't get it. Their minds, all the flaws are happening in their minds. It's giving them this level of certainty, and it's making this more of a combative thing. So I think there's something to that, where if you can train in a way more like jujitsu, where you're actually tested, and you can't just believe it in your head and develop this certainty and think, in theory, I've got it. It has to be in practice. Right? If there's a way to make it a little bit more lifelike, to make those things that people get so confident about be tested earlier on, perhaps that's a way to start to combat this. So it's not just kind of, you know, marinating in your own head and in circles of people that think like you, but you're forced to use it in a more real life scenario and test it. Again, it's somewhat of a half-baked idea, but I wanted to at least tease it out in this video and bring it back in another video because I think perhaps there's something to that to address this issue, right? This dilemma we have of we want free speech, but we're afraid that some of it is dangerous because people aren't equipped to handle it all, particularly when it comes to media or social media. Maybe this is an initial starting point of how to address that.